My wife handed me a list of chores. Do these, or I'm leaving. I said fine. Then I hired a maid with her shopping budget and forwarded the bill. The next day, she was pleading for my forgiveness. I, 34M, never thought my marriage would come down to a piece of paper with 17 items on it. But there I was, staring at what my wife called her final ultimatum. She'd left it on the kitchen counter that morning before heading to her spin class, weighted down by her coffee mug like it was some kind of official document. The list was typed, not handwritten. That detail stuck with me because it meant she'd put actual effort into this, sitting at her laptop and formatting bullet points while I was probably sleeping in the next room. Clean the gutters. Organize the garage. Repaint the fence. Power wash the driveway. Deep clean the basement. The tasks went on, each one a project that would take hours, maybe an entire weekend. At the bottom, she'd added a note in bold. These need to be done by the end of the month, or I'm seriously reconsidering this marriage. I read it 3 times, waiting for anger to hit, but instead I just felt tired. We'd been married for 6 years, and somewhere along the way, I'd become less of a partner and more of a handyman she kept around for home improvement projects. The conversation we'd had the night before suddenly made sense. She'd asked if I was planning to finally handle things around here, and I'd assumed she meant the usual weekend tasks. Apparently, she'd meant everything she'd been mentally cataloging for months. My wife had always been particular about the house. When we first got married, I found it endearing how she'd rearrange the living room furniture until it felt just right, or how she'd spend hours researching the perfect shade of white for the bedroom walls. But after her promotion 2 years ago, something shifted. The house became her project, her domain, and I became the contractor she hadn't hired but expected to perform like one anyway. I looked around our kitchen with its marble countertops and custom backsplash, all things she'd chosen and I'd paid for. The mortgage was entirely in my name because her credit had been wrecked from student loans when we met. I'd spent 3 years helping her pay those off, never asking for anything in return because that's what partners do. Or at least, that's what I thought they did. My phone buzzed with a text from her. The message was short. Did you see the list? We need to talk tonight. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I made myself breakfast and sat at that same kitchen counter, really thinking about our marriage for the first time in months. The pattern had been there for a while. I just hadn't wanted to see it. She'd make plans without consulting me, then get frustrated when I didn't enthusiastically participate. She'd spend money from our joint account on things for herself, but question every purchase I made. The chore list wasn't really about chores at all. When she came home that evening, I was sitting in the living room with my laptop. She walked in with that determined expression I'd come to recognize, the one that meant she was ready for a confrontation she'd already scripted in her head. She asked if I'd read her list, and I told her I had. She launched into this whole explanation about how she couldn't live in a house that was falling apart, how she needed a partner who took initiative, how she was tired of having to ask for things to get done. I listened without interrupting, watching her work herself up into the righteous anger she'd probably been rehearsing all day. When she finally paused for breath, I asked her one simple question. I wanted to know if she remembered that I worked 60 hours a week at my job, while she worked 40 at hers. She waved that away, saying her job was more stressful and she needed her downtime. I asked about the fact that I did the grocery shopping, the cooking, and handled all of our finances. She said those were basic tasks that didn't count as real contributions to the home. That's when I asked about her shopping budget. She spent roughly $1,200 a month on clothes, accessories, beauty treatments, and her various fitness classes. Money from our joint account that I never complained about because I wanted her to be happy. Her face shifted then, something defensive crossing her features. She told me that was different, that she deserved those things, that she worked hard and needed to look professional. I agreed with her. I told her she was absolutely right that she deserved those things. Then I said I'd handle the chores, exactly as she wanted, but I'd need to reallocate some funds to make it happen. She looked confused, asking what I meant by reallocating funds. I explained it simply. Since I worked those long hours and apparently didn't have time to properly maintain the house to her standards, I'd hire help, professional help. And since she'd made it clear that household contributions were paramount to our marriage's survival, her discretionary spending would be going toward that help instead. She laughed at first, that sharp laugh she used when she thought I was being ridiculous. She said I was being petty and childish, that this wasn't about money. It was about me being a better husband. I asked her to define what a better husband looked like because from where I sat, I was already carrying most of the weight. That's when the argument really started. She accused me of throwing money in her face, of being controlling, of trying to punish her for having standards. I stayed calm, which seemed to make her angrier. I told her she'd given me an ultimatum, and I was simply responding to it in the most practical way possible. Either I could spend my weekends doing 17 major projects, or I could hire professionals to do them properly while I actually got some rest. She demanded to know if I was serious about cutting off her shopping money, and I corrected her. I wasn't cutting it off. I was redirecting it toward our shared household needs, exactly as she'd emphasized in her list. She could still spend whatever she wanted from her own paycheck on personal items. Her face went red and she started yelling about how dare I control her money. It was a joint account. I reminded her that I contributed 70% of what went into that joint account, and if she wanted to split things equitably, we could do that too. We could sit down and divide every expense based on our individual incomes, and she could handle her percentage of the mortgage, utilities, and household costs from her own funds. She stared at me like I'd become a stranger, and maybe I had. Maybe I'd finally stopped being the accommodating husband who absorbed every demand without pushing back. She told me I was being unreasonable, that married couples didn't operate like roommates splitting bills. I agreed completely, which surprised her. I said married couples also didn't hand each other ultimatums and treat their partners like employees who needed performance reviews. She left the room, slamming the bedroom door behind her. I heard her on the phone shortly after, probably calling her sister or her best friend to complain about what an awful person I was. I didn't care anymore. I'd spent 6 years trying to be enough for someone who kept moving the goalposts, and I was done chasing. The next morning, I started making calls. I found a cleaning service that could come twice a week for deep cleaning. I hired a handyman service that could tackle all 17 items on her list within 2 weeks. I arranged for a landscaping company to handle the yard work monthly. The total cost came to about $1,500 to complete everything immediately, then roughly $1,000 monthly for ongoing maintenance. I meticulously documented every expense and sent her an email with all the invoices and receipts, CCing myself from our joint email account. I explained that as requested, I was handling the household maintenance, and these were the costs associated with meeting her standards. I also attached a proposed budget showing how we'd need to reduce her discretionary spending by about $1,200 monthly to accommodate these new household expenses. Her response came within 10 minutes. She called me while I was at work, her voice shaking with rage. She said I was insane, that I couldn't just hire people without discussing it with her first, that I was deliberately trying to hurt her. I reminded her that she'd given me a deadline and an ultimatum, and I was simply meeting her requirements. She started crying, saying I was being cruel, that this wasn't what she meant. I asked her what she did mean then. Silence. She couldn't answer because we both knew what she'd meant. She'd wanted me to scramble, to drop everything and prioritize her list to prove I cared about her needs. She'd wanted the power dynamic where she issued orders and I followed them, grateful for the clarity. She tried a different approach, softening her voice. She said we needed to talk about this in person, that we were both stressed and not communicating well. I agreed to talk that evening, but told her the services were already booked and I wasn't canceling them. She asked how I could be so cold, and I told her I wasn't being cold. I was being efficient. That evening, she was waiting for me when I got home. She'd clearly been crying, her eyes red and puffy. She'd also clearly been thinking because she came at this from a completely different angle. She apologized for the list, said she'd been overwhelmed and handled it wrong. She wanted us to work together on the house projects, make them couple activities on the weekends. I told her that sounded nice, but didn't address the actual problem. She asked what problem I meant, and I laid it out. For 2 years, she'd been treating me like I existed to serve her needs while my needs didn't matter. The list was just the most obvious example. I was tired of being the one who compromised, who sacrificed, who bent to accommodate her while getting nothing in return. She protested that she did plenty for our marriage, and I asked her to give me examples from the last 6 months. She struggled, eventually landing on the fact that she'd planned our anniversary dinner. I pointed out that I'd paid for that dinner, and she'd chosen a restaurant I'd mentioned not liking because she wanted to try their new menu. She started crying harder, saying I was attacking her, that I was keeping score like some kind of accountant. I told her she was right. I was keeping score because she'd turned our marriage into a transaction where I was always in debt. Her list wasn't about chores, it was about control. She denied that, but I could see the realization dawning in her eyes. She'd never thought of it that way, had never considered that her constant demands and criticisms were anything other than reasonable expectations. She asked what I wanted from her, and I told her the truth. I wanted a partner, not a boss. I wanted someone who saw my contributions instead of only noticing what I hadn't done yet. She asked if I was saying I wanted a divorce, her voice small and scared. I told her I didn't know what I wanted anymore, except to stop feeling like I was failing a test I'd never been given the study guide for. The maid and handyman services were coming, and we'd have a clean, maintained house just like she wanted. We could use that time to figure out if we actually liked each other anymore. Update 1. The cleaning service came that first Tuesday, and I'd never seen my wife so uncomfortable. She hovered around the house while two women efficiently moved through each room, scrubbing and organizing with professional precision. She kept trying to tell them they didn't need to do certain things, that she could handle it, but they politely continued with their assigned tasks. When I got home from work, the house was immaculate. My wife was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine, staring at nothing. She said it felt weird having strangers in our home, and I asked if the house was clean to her standards. She admitted it was spotless, maybe even better than she could have done it herself. I told her that was the point. The handyman crew arrived that Thursday, 3 guys who made quick work of the fence painting and gutter cleaning. My wife watched from the window, her arms crossed. That evening, she tried to start a conversation about how much money we were spending, but I shut it down. I showed her the budget again, pointing out that we were spending less on household maintenance than she typically spent on her monthly shopping trips. She got defensive, saying those were different, that I was punishing her. I asked how it was punishment to use our joint funds for joint household needs instead of her personal wants. She didn't have an answer, but I could see her frustration building. She wasn't used to me standing firm on anything. By the end of the second week, everything on her list was complete. The garage was organized with custom shelving. The basement was deep cleaned and reorganized. The driveway looked brand new. The total bill came to about $1,800, and I paid it from our joint account without hesitation. I sent her another email with the final invoice and a note. All tasks from your list completed as requested. Her response surprised me. She asked if I could come home early that Friday, that she wanted to make me dinner and talk. I was skeptical but agreed. When I arrived home, she'd actually cooked, something she rarely did despite being decent at it. She'd made my favorite meal, pot roast with roasted vegetables, and she'd set the table with candles. It felt like she was trying to seduce me back into complacency, but I sat down anyway. She apologized again, but this time it felt different, more genuine. She said she'd spent the last 2 weeks really thinking about our marriage, about how she'd been acting. She admitted she'd been taking me for granted, treating me like her needs were the only ones that mattered. She blamed stress at work, pressure from her friends who all seemed to have perfect homes, and her own insecurities about not being good enough. I listened, but didn't let myself soften too quickly. I'd heard apologies before that didn't lead to actual change. I asked her what she planned to do differently, and she had clearly thought about this. She wanted to start marriage counseling to learn better communication. She wanted to create a more equitable division of both household tasks and decision-making. She wanted to rebuild what we'd lost. I told her I was willing to try counseling, but that things couldn't go back to how they were. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and said she understood. She admitted she'd been terrified I was going to divorce her, that she'd realized how close she'd come to destroying our marriage with her behavior. That weekend, she did something that genuinely shocked me. She went through her closet and pulled out bags of clothes with the tags still on them, items she'd bought and never worn. She estimated she'd wasted about $4,000 in the last year alone on impulse purchases. She wanted to return what she could and put that money toward our savings, toward our future instead of her vanity. I didn't ask her to do that, and I told her so. She said she knew, but she needed to. She needed to prove to herself as much as to me that she could change, that she valued our partnership more than her shopping habits. Update 2. We started counseling 3 weeks after the list incident. Our therapist was a woman in her 50s who didn't take nonsense from either of us. In our first session, my wife tried to frame the situation as a communication breakdown, but the therapist pushed deeper. She asked my wife to explain why she'd felt entitled to issue ultimatums, and my wife struggled to answer. Over the following sessions, a lot came out. My wife had grown up in a household where her mother managed everything and her father was largely absent, emotionally checked out. She'd internalized this dynamic as normal, as what marriage looked like. When I didn't fit that mold, when I had my own needs and opinions, it frustrated her because it didn't match her template. She also admitted that her friends contributed to the problem. They'd all compare houses and husbands, turning it into some kind of competition. She'd felt inadequate because our house wasn't as perfectly maintained as theirs, not realizing that many of them had hired help or had stay-at-home spouses with more time. For my part, the therapist called me out too. She said I'd been conflict avoidant, allowing resentment to build instead of addressing issues as they arose. By always accommodating, I'd enabled my wife's behavior and then suddenly snapped with the maid hiring, which, while justified, was also passive-aggressive. She was right. We both had work to do, but for the first time, we were actually doing it together. My wife started taking on more household responsibilities without being asked, and I started speaking up when something bothered me instead of swallowing it. The cleaning service continued to come once a week, which we both agreed was a good investment in our time together. The biggest change came about 2 months in. My wife got a job offer for a position that would pay significantly more but require occasional travel. Older would have accepted immediately and expected me to adjust. Instead, she came to me and we discussed it together, weighing the pros and cons as partners. She took the job, and we worked out how to handle things when she was away. She also did something that meant more to me than she probably realized. She suggested we open separate checking accounts in addition to our joint one. She wanted to contribute her fair share to household expenses and savings, then have her own money for her personal spending that didn't impact our shared finances. It was her idea, her way of showing she understood the inequality she'd created. Things weren't perfect, but they were better. We laughed together again, actually enjoyed each other's company instead of just coexisting. The house stayed clean, the projects stayed done, and we had our weekends back to actually be a couple. Update 3. 6 months after the list, my wife brought something up during dinner. She'd been tracking her spending and realized she was happier spending less on things and more on experiences with me. She wanted to take the money she'd been saving and plan a real vacation, just the two of us, something we hadn't done since our honeymoon. We ended up booking a trip to Colorado for hiking and a few days in a cabin. No luxury resort, no packed itinerary, just time together. During that trip, sitting on the cabin's porch watching the sunset, she thanked me for not giving up on us. She said the maid hire had been a wake-up call she desperately needed, that she'd been so caught up in superficial things that she'd almost lost what actually mattered. I told her I'd been close to giving up, that if she'd doubled down on her demands instead of reflecting, we wouldn't have made it. She knew that, and I think that knowledge kept her committed to changing. We're coming up on our 7-year anniversary now, and we're in a better place than we've been in years. The cleaning service still comes weekly, which we both appreciate. We split household projects based on interest and skill rather than gender roles or arbitrary expectations. We make decisions together, actual discussions where both voices matter. My wife still has moments where she slips into old patterns, wanting everything her way immediately, but now she catches herself. She'll pause, take a breath, and rephrase her demand as a request or a discussion point. It's a small thing, but it makes all the difference. The list is still in my desk drawer. I kept it as a reminder of how close we came to the edge and how much work it takes to build something better. Sometimes she sees it and winces, embarrassed by who she was then. I remind her that we all have moments we're not proud of. What matters is what we do after. Looking back, I don't regret hiring that maid service or standing my ground. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their worst tendencies. My wife needed to face the consequences of treating our marriage like a dictatorship, and I needed to stop being a doormat. We both grew from it. Marriage isn't about one person serving the other or keeping score. It's about building something together where both people feel valued and heard. It took almost losing everything for us to figure that out, but I'm grateful we did. The house is clean, the projects are done, and for the first time in years, we're actually partners. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe and hype button would mean the world to us. Please subscribe and press the hype button.